1969. Pontiac GTO Judge Ram Air 3. The Pontiac GTO is widely credited as the car that ignited the American muscle car movement in the mid-1960s. But it was the 1969 GTO Judge, especially with the Ram Air 3 and Ram Air 4 engines, that really made insurers nervous. By the end of the decade, mid-size coupes with big V8s were everywhere, and Pontiac leaned into that culture with a package that was as loud visually as it was mechanically. The Judge was aimed squarely at younger, performance-minded buyers, the exact group that already showed elevated accident rates in company data. The Judge package transformed the GTO from a fast car into a rolling billboard for speed. It wore wild, high-impact colors, oversized stripes, a rear spoiler, and bold Judge graphics, backed by ads that openly celebrated street performance. Under the hood, the standard Ram Air 3 400 cubic inches displacement V8 was rated at 366 horsepower, with higher flow heads and a hotter cam in the optional Ram Air 4, bringing the rating to 370 horsepower. In the real world, both engines were widely believed to be underrated and easily capable of low 13-second quarter-mile times with traction and gearing. For insurers, cars like this created a new kind of headache. Early in the decade, they could get by, rating a vehicle on basic factors like body style, curb weight, and displacement. But by 1969, claim files showed that certain combinations, intermediate coupes, 4-speed transmissions, and high-compression big blocks with aggressive induction systems were massively overrepresented in serious crashes, particularly when the policyholder was under 25. The GTO, especially in Ram Air form, was one of several GM intermediates that kept popping up in those loss reports. In response, many companies began introducing explicit performance car surcharges. High-compression engines, multiple carburetors or special Ram Air systems, 4-speed gearboxes, and axle ratios optimized for acceleration were all treated as red flags. That shift didn't happen because of the GTO Judge alone, but it became a symbol of the problem, an affordable, heavily advertised performance package overwhelmingly bought by young drivers. In some markets, the premiums on a Ram Air GTO could rival or even exceed the monthly car payment for a driver in their early 20s. The 1969 GTO Judge Ram Air 3 and 4 stands today as one of the defining muscle cars of its era. It helped prove to the insurance industry that horsepower ratings, option codes, and even marketing cues had to be factored into risk models. The car didn't single-handedly rewrite the rulebook, but it absolutely helped push insurers toward the more detailed performance-based classifications that would shadow every muscle car that followed. 1970. Chevrolet Chevelle SS 450 4LS6. The 1970 Chevrolet Chevelle SS 454 LS6 is one of the most feared machines of the muscle car era, and it arrived just as insurance companies were tightening the screws on high-performance cars. On paper, the LS6 454 cubic inches displacement V8 was rated at 450 horsepower and 500 pound-feet of torque, the highest advertised gross horsepower number of any regular production American car at the time. Engineers gave it 11.2, 5-to-1 compression, big rectangular port heads, a solid lifter camshaft, forged internals, and a large Holley 4-barrel carburetor feeding an aluminum intake. Period tests recorded quarter-mile times in the 13-second range at over 100 miles per hour in essentially showroom trim. Enthusiasts quickly realized that the LS6 was underrated. Tuners and racers regularly reported outputs well above the factory figure, and some claimed 500-plus horsepower with minor tweaks. Regardless of the exact number, the message to insurers was clear. This was a car that put race-level power in the hands of ordinary buyers. Unlike ultra-rare Copo specials, the LS6 package could be ordered on hundreds of Chevelles, meaning a meaningful population of very fast cars would end up in daily use. By 1970, many insurance companies had already introduced new, high-performance categories. But the LS6 Chevelle became one of the cars that defined those brackets. Underwriters looked at more than displacement. They paid attention to advertised horsepower, compression ratio, the presence of a 4-barrel or multiple carburetors, and options like heavy-duty cooling and positive traction rear axles. A 4, 50 horsepower, big block intermediate coupe with performance gearing ticked every box. For drivers under 25, the premiums quoted on an LS6 could be multiples of a comparable 6-cylinder or small block Chevelle. The result was a kind of soft barrier to ownership. The LS6 wasn't formally banned or restricted by regulators, but in practice, insurance pricing made it hard for younger buyers to carry coverage. That pressure came on top of newly emerging emissions rules and looming unleaded fuel requirements. Within a year, compression ratios were falling across Detroit's product lines, and peak advertised horsepower numbers began to tumble. The LS6 Chevelle is remembered today as a high watermark for street performance, but it also marks the point where insurers stopped treating big block supersports as just another car and instead placed them in the highest risk, highest premium categories they had. 1968 Plymouth Roadrunner 426 Hemi. The 1968 Plymouth Roadrunner was created to deliver maximum performance at minimum cost, and that formula made insurance companies very uncomfortable. Plymouth started with a mid-size body shell and stripped out most of the frills. Interiors were basic. Sound deadening was minimal. and standard power came from a 383 cubic inches displacement V8. The whole point was to undercut other muscle cars on price while keeping all the speed. Then, Plymouth added the optional 426 Hemi, and suddenly, an inexpensive coupe could be ordered with an engine originally designed for NASCAR and drag racing. The Hemi Roadrunner was brutally quick. The 426 cubic inches displacement elephant motor carried a conservative 425 horsepower gross rating and 490 pound-feet of torque, with 10.2 5-to-1 compression, massive valves, and dual 4-barrel carburetors. In magazine tests, Hemi-equipped bodies were capable of low 13-second quarter-mile times, and with gearing and tires, they could dip even lower. Coupled with the Roadrunner's low sticker price, that performance made it one of the best power per dollar deals in the showroom and a magnet for young drivers who wanted maximum acceleration for minimal cash. Insurers were already seeing troubling patterns in the late 1960s. Claim data showed that mid-sized two-door hardtops with large, high-compression V8s and manual transmissions were overrepresented in serious accidents, especially when the policyholder was under 25. The Hemi Roadrunner fit that profile perfectly. Although early rating systems focused mostly on displacement and body style, many companies began informally treating any 426 Hemi car as a worst-case risk, regardless of whether it was in a Roadrunner, GTX, or Charger. Premiums on Hemi cars were frequently far higher than on otherwise similar 383 or 440 models. Rather than inventing entirely new formulas just for the Roadrunner, insurers folded it into a broader shift toward performance-sensitive pricing. High-compression big blocks, multiple carburetors, and factory drag race options became triggers for surcharges or coverage refusals. The cheap and fast philosophy behind the Hemi Roadrunner helped prove that affordability could multiply risk. When extreme power was accessible to inexperienced drivers, both claim frequency and severity went up. The 1968 Hemi Roadrunner remains a legend of blue-collar performance, but it also stands as a prime example of the kind of car that convinced insurers they had to treat engine codes and performance packages as serious risk factors, not just enthusiast bragging rights. 1969. Dodge Charger Daytona. The 1969 Dodge Charger Daytona was engineered with a single purpose: dominate NASCAR through aerodynamics, and it did that so effectively that it changed racing and made insurers look twice at what stock really meant. Dodge took the mid-size Charger and transformed it with a wind tunnel-tested nose cone, a huge rear wing, a flush rear window plug, and other detail tweaks that slash drag and increase stability at high speeds. With either the 440 Magnum or the 426 Hemi under the hood, the Daytona became the first NASCAR stock car to officially break 200 miles per hour, a milestone that forced rule changes from the sanctioning body. To homologate the car, Dodge had to sell street-legal versions, and that's where insurance companies came in. The Daytona wasn't cheap, but it attracted hardcore performance buyers who knew exactly what it was: race engineering with a license plate. On paper, its engines didn't look drastically different from other body Mopars, but the aerodynamic package gave the car a top speed and high-speed stability advantage that ordinary muscle cars simply didn't have. For underwriters, that meant a new kind of risk. This was a car that could cruise at speeds far beyond any legal limit with confidence, and that raised questions about how to rate it. Rather than creating formal aero surcharges line by line, insurers generally placed the Daytona into the highest existing performance categories: high displacement, high advertised horsepower, 4-barrel carburation, and a history connected to 200 miles per hour. NASCAR runs all pushed premiums up, especially for younger drivers. In some markets, insurance for a Daytona or its Plymouth Superbird cousin could easily exceed what the same driver would pay on a less exotic big block car, effectively limiting these homologation specials to older, more affluent owners or dedicated racers. The combination of NASCAR rule changes and punishing insurance costs helped ensure that aero cars were a brief phenomenon. Production numbers stayed low, and the experiment ended after just one season of street models. Today, the 1969 Dodge Charger Daytona is remembered as a triumph of wind tunnel design and one of the most dramatic muscle cars ever built. From the insurance industry's perspective, it highlighted that performance wasn't just about cubic inches anymore. Top speed potential, race-borne aerodynamics, and track records were all signals that a car was more likely to be driven at the ragged edge and needed to be priced like it. 1969. Ford Mustang Boss 429. The 1969 Ford Mustang Boss 429 was built first and foremost as a homologation tool, not a street bruiser, and that distinction mattered to insurance companies trying to keep up with late 1960s performance escalation. Ford needed to build at least 500 examples of its new 429 cubic inches displacement semi-Hemi racing engine for NASCAR, so it contracted Carcraft to shoehorn the big block into the Mustang Fastback. The process required extensive structural changes, a reworked front suspension, modified shock towers, and additional bracing, effectively turning the car into a street-legal shell wrapped around a competition-bred power plant. Under the hood, the Boss 429 used 4-bolt mains, a forged crank, and big port canted valve heads with crescent-shaped combustion chambers. A Holley 4-barrel carburetor on an aluminum intake fed the engine, which carried an official rating of 375 horsepower and 450 pound-feet of torque at around 10.5 to 1 compression, figures many enthusiasts considered conservative given the engine's NASCAR roots. On the street, however, the Boss 429 was less dominant than its specifications suggested. Emissions equipment, a relatively mild cam for street use, and tall gearing all blunted its quarter-mile performance compared to some cheaper big-block Mustangs and rival brands' drag-oriented specials. Insurers didn't care about that nuance. What they saw in the late 60s was a pattern. Cars with large, high-compression big blocks and youth-oriented marketing were tied to rising accident costs. The Boss 429's huge displacement, racing pedigree, and limited production made it an obvious candidate for the highest performance rating categories, even if its showroom performance didn't always match its legend. Underwriters were unlikely to study valve lift or specific cylinder head castings, but they definitely paid attention to engine size, advertised horsepower, and the fact that the car existed primarily to qualify a NASCAR engine. As premiums climbed for all big block muscle cars around 1970 to 1971, the Boss 429's already high purchase price was compounded by costly insurance, especially for younger buyers. Production ended after 1970, and Ford's official racing program shifted direction. Today, the 1969 Mustang Boss 429 is valued as a blue-chip collectible and a fascinating example of race engineering adapted to the street. For insurance history, it represents how homologation specials, built to satisfy rulebooks rather than commuters, pushed companies to treat any large displacement, competition-linked engine as inherently high risk, regardless of how often it actually saw a drag strip or superspeedway. 1966 Oldsmobile 442W30. The 1966 Oldsmobile 442W30 was a turning point for Oldsmobile's image, and a subtle wake-up call for insurers who had long treated the brand as conservative and low risk. Oldsmobile was traditionally associated with older, more cautious buyers, and standard 442 models fit that fast but refined reputation. The W30 package, however, was built with drag strips in mind. It combined a high-compression, 400 cubic inches displacement V8 with functional ram air induction, more aggressive cam timing, and weight-conscious tweaks that pushed the car's real-world performance into the same league as Pontiac GTOs and other headline muscle machines. On paper, the W30 engine shared the 360 horsepower gross rating of Oldsmobile's L69 tri-carb setup, but its functional cold air system and internal upgrades made it quicker than those numbers suggested. Air was routed from special scoops tucked behind the front bumper through hoses to a sealed air cleaner, feeding a hotter cam and high-flow intake. Only a few dozen W30s were built for 1966, many as purpose-built drag cars ordered with 4-speed transmissions and steep rear gears. Contemporary testing showed mid-13-second quarter-mile times, making them legitimate threats at the track despite their upscale trim. Initially, many insurers lumped 442s in with other Oldsmobiles, assuming the buyers would be older and more cautious. But as lost experience from performance intermediates came in, that assumption started to crack. Underwriters noticed that certain Olds models, especially those coded for high-compression engines and special induction packages, were showing up alongside GTOs and Fairlanes in serious claims. The W30's combination of luxury appointments and genuine drag strip performance demonstrated that a premium badge no longer guaranteed a low-risk owner. While it would be an exaggeration to say the W30 alone made the industry abandon brand-based rating, it definitely contributed to a broader shift toward performance-driven classification. Insurers increasingly looked at horsepower ratings, compression ratios, functional ram air equipment, and axle ratios when pricing coverage, regardless of whether the car wore a Buick, Oldsmobile, or Pontiac emblem. The 1966 Oldsmobile 440 2W30 stands today as a rare and coveted muscle car, but it also serves as an example of how performance could be hidden under a respectable image and why insurers learned not to trust stereotypes about safe brands. 1969 Chevrolet Camaro ZL1. The 1969 Chevrolet Camaro ZL1 is one of the most extreme factory-built American performance cars ever made, and it exposed just how far manufacturers were willing to go to understate horsepower. Built under Copo 9560, only 69 cars were produced, each powered by the all-aluminum 427 cubic inches displacement ZL1 big block derived from Chevrolet's Can-Am racing program. The engine alone cost more than a base V8 Camaro, and it was designed with open-chamber heads, a radical solid lifter camshaft, and forged internals. Officially, Chevrolet rated it at 430 gross horsepower, but internal and independent tests suggested well over 500 horsepower in near-stock form. In a lightweight F-body shell with 4.10-to-1 gears, the ZL1 was capable of low 13-second or better quarter-mile times right off the showroom floor, and much quicker with headers, slicks, and careful tuning. The car was aimed squarely at NHRA Superstock and other drag racing classes, not daily commuting. For insurers, that purpose was a red flag. This wasn't just a powerful street car, it was essentially a race package sold through dealers. To an underwriter already wary of big block Camaros, an aluminum 427 tied to organized drag racing looked like one of the highest risk scenarios imaginable. At the time, many companies still relied heavily on displacement and advertised horsepower to set surcharges. The ZL1 highlighted the limitations of that approach. Its official 430 horse figure didn't fully reflect its performance potential. and enthusiasts knew it. As word spread about the car's true capability, some insurers began informally treating any Copo 427 Camaro, especially ZL1 second, as top-tier risks regardless of the brochure rating. In practice, that meant very high premiums or outright refusals to write coverage for young or unproven drivers. Dealers struggled to sell ZL1 second. High base prices and punishing insurance costs kept most customers away, and some cars sat on lots until they were discounted or converted for racing. The ZL1 didn't by itself cause a formal overhaul of rating methods, but it became a prominent example in enthusiast and industry circles of just how misleading gross horsepower numbers could be. Today, the 1969 Camaro ZL1 is legendary for its rarity and brutality. And it also illustrates why insurers began looking beyond published figures to real-world performance when classifying the wildest muscle cars of the era. 1969 Chevrolet Nova SS 396L78. The 1969 Chevrolet Nova SS 396L78 was proof that raw power in a small package could scare insurers every bit as much as the big, flashy muscle cars. The Nova had started life as a modest compact, but the SS 396 option turned it into a sleeper. The top-spec L78 396 cubic inches displacement big block was rated at 375 gross horsepower with a solid lifter camshaft, high compression, and big valve heads. Dropped into a relatively light Nova body, it created a power-to-weight ratio that put the car right alongside Chevelles, Camaros, and other big-name muscle machines in straight-line performance. On the street and strip, L78 Novas earned a reputation for being deceptively quick. With simple traction aids and gearing, they were capable of low 13-second quarter-mile times or better. Yet visually, they could pass for basic economy models apart from subtle SS trim. That combination, affordable, compact, and extremely fast, made the car especially attractive to young drivers who might not be able to afford a fully loaded Chevelle or Camaro. It was exactly the scenario insurers were worried about: high output in the hands of less experienced owners. There isn't solid evidence that New York or any other state officially blacklisted the L78 Nova or set a hard 400 horsepower legal limit for insurability. What did happen, however, was more subtle, as internal loss data and outside studies showed that certain high horsepower, small body combinations were overrepresented in serious crashes. Many companies began informally treating cars like the L78 Nova as top-tier risks. Underwriters knew from road tests and racing that engines like the 375 horse 396 often made more power than their ratings suggested, and they priced accordingly, especially for policyholders under 25. In practice, young buyers trying to insure an L78 Nova in the early 1970s often ran into very high premiums or coverage limits that made ownership difficult. The car became a case study among enthusiasts in how insurance could effectively outlaw certain combinations without any formal ban. The 1969 Nova SS 396L78 remains one of the clearest examples of how putting a true high-performance big block into a compact body pushed insurers toward more aggressive performance-based rating, even if no official 400 horsepower line was ever written into law. 1970 Buick GSX Stage 1. The 1970 Buick GSX Stage 1 shattered the stereotype that Buicks were for cautious, older drivers, and that mismatch between image and performance caused real concern for insurers. Buick's GS455 already offered serious power, but the GSX package added bold graphics, spoilers, and handling upgrades, while the optional Stage 1 engine took things further. The 455 cubic inches displacement big block was officially rated at 360 gross horsepower and a towering 510 pound-feet of torque, one of the highest torque figures of the muscle car era. Period tests recorded quarter-mile times as quick as 13.38 seconds at over 105 miles per hour, prompting Motor Trend to call the GS455 Stage 1 the quickest American production car they had ever tested. Enthusiasts and some sanctioning bodies believed the Stage 1 was underrated. The combination of big valves, a hotter camshaft, optimized ignition, and efficient heads suggested more than 360 horsepower in real-world trim. Yet from the curb, the GSX still looked like a highline Buick, with a plush interior and a more refined demeanor than many rivals. For underwriters accustomed to treating Buicks as low risk, that presented a problem. Claim files and magazine tests were now telling them that at least some Buicks belonged in the same performance conversation as GTOs, Chevelles, and Hemi Mopars. There's no solid documentary evidence that New York's insurance regulators formally labeled the GSX Stage 1 the most dangerous car in America, but there is clear indication that the car and others like it were viewed as high risk. Insurers increasingly relied on measurable factors: advertised horsepower, torque, engine size, compression ratio, and proven quarter-mile performance, rather than brand reputation. A 455 cubic inches displacement, high compression big block, with over 500 pound-feet of torque and magazine-verified low 13-second capability was inevitably placed in the top surcharge brackets, especially when sold with bright paint and graphics that appealed to younger drivers. The impact on sales was noticeable. Between rising premiums and new emissions rules, the peak output GSX Stage 1 existed for only a brief window before compression ratios and ratings fell for 1971. Today, it stands as one of the greatest sleeper threats of the era. Flashy on the outside, but still carrying Buick's reputation for comfort. For insurance history, the 1970 Buick GSX Stage 1 illustrates how companies learned that a luxury badge was no guarantee of low risk and that torque, performance testing, and engine codes could matter more than the emblem on the grille. 1970 Plymouth AAR Cuda 340. The 1970 Plymouth AAR Cuda 340 was one of the most distinctive muscle cars of its era, built as a street counterpart to Plymouth's SCCA Trans Am road racing program. Named after Dan Gurney's All-American racers, the AAR took the E-body Cuda and reworked it for handling and high revolutions per minute power instead of pure straight-line brute force. Under the fiberglass fresh air hood sat a 340 cubic inches displacement, small block equipped with a 6-barrel induction setup, 3 2-barrel Holley carburetors on an aluminum intake, rated at 290 gross horsepower, but tuned for quick response and mid-range punch. Chassis changes were just as important. The AAR received a special suspension with heavy-duty shocks, quick ratio steering, staggered tire sizes, and a slightly nose-down, tail-up stance. Most visually striking was the side exit exhaust, which dumped ahead of the rear wheels through unique tips and added both sound and attitude. High-impact colors, strobe side stripes with the AAR shield, a ducktail rear spoiler, and a matte black hood made the car impossible to miss. Unlike big block and Hemi Cudas, the AAR emphasized balance, enough power to be quick, but with road course-friendly braking and cornering. Because of its low stance and side exit exhaust, the AAR Cuda occasionally brushed up against state inspection and noise regulations, particularly as cars aged or were modified further. However, there's no strong evidence of a formal, months-long statewide ban in Pennsylvania or elsewhere on stock AARs passing inspection. Instead, owners sometimes had to prove that the unusual exhaust routing and ride height were factory equipment, not illegal aftermarket modifications. In some cases, inspectors or officers unfamiliar with the model treated it like a modified car until documentation was produced. From an insurance standpoint, the AAR Cuda was grouped with other high-performance pony cars of the time. The relatively small 340 engine didn't carry the same stigma as a 426 Hemi or 446 pack, but factors like multiple carburetors, performance suspensions, and youth-targeted graphics still pushed it into elevated premium brackets. As with many specialty muscle cars in 1970, rising insurance costs and changing emissions rules meant the AAR Cuda lasted just one model year. Today, it's celebrated as a rare blend of Trans Am road race flavor and street practicality, and as another example of how factory race-inspired hardware could complicate both inspection and insurance in the waning days of the muscle car era.